I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. The Earth's atmosphere is getting warmer and warmer, and the consequences we're already seeing are becoming more and more dire. Yet not nearly enough people are paying attention. Mention climate change, and you are likely to trigger a collective yawn. Right here in the United States, we are experiencing insane downpours, resulting in tragically destructive flooding in heavily populated areas. Hurricanes and tornadoes of frightening intensity are occurring with truly ominous frequency. Massive wildfires here and in Canada are taking a staggering toll. Smoke from hundreds of wildfires burning out of control in Canada a few years ago actually turned the skies over New York City a freakish orange color. If we don't take much tougher steps to mitigate the impacts of climate change, we are guaranteed to face outcomes that are far worse and far more tragic than those we are already experiencing. Why is this not a bigger news story? Why are people not more alarmed? I'll discuss this and other climate-related matters with one of the world's leading experts on climate, Dr. Michael Oppenheimer, the Albert G. Milbank Professor of Geosciences and International Affairs at Princeton University. He was part of the international team of scientists on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. I could go on, but if we were to list all of his credits, it would consume the entire half hour. So I'll just say, welcome, Michael. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me here, Bob.
Global temperatures reached, if I'm not mistaken, the highest levels ever recorded this past July. From your perspective, what is it that's crucial for the public to understand about the changes that are going on now in the climate?
What's crucial to know is there's a big climate change going on, that although climate change has occurred naturally over Earth's history, this is something different. This is something that we have no doubt that human beings have caused. And unless we decrease sharply the emissions of the pollutants that are causing the problem, primarily carbon dioxide from burning coal, oil, and natural gas, we're really going to be in the hot soup later. We're going to get more of these intense hurricanes. We're going to get more of just the intense regular rainstorms we see. We're going to get more record heat until, in some places on Earth, it will simply become uninhabitable. So there are huge changes going to happen to society, to other species and natural ecosystems, to the ability of many people, particularly the poorer people in the United States, poor people in poor countries, to deal with this and to really thrive. So this is really a problem which needs to be gotten ahead of. And right now we're simply falling behind because emissions continue to increase globally. And maybe worse yet, there's a large commitment to a greater climate change than we're already seeing, and we haven't figured out how to deal with it. For several decades, the climate change is baked in, and it's going to get hotter and hotter, more and more intense rains until we turn emissions around. Then there's yet more lag. We have to learn how to protect ourselves. We're doing a lousy job at that at this point.
The initial international agreements were aimed at holding the warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above what temperatures were on average at the beginning of the industrial age. I think you told me that we're now at about 1.3 degrees warming and increasing. I think that we're probably going to just blow past 1.5 degrees, which was the benchmark.
That's what's going to happen.
What will be the consequences of that?
The Earth's average temperature, as you said, is about 1.3 degrees Celsius, about a little less than 3 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than it was, say, in 1800. Mm-hmm. And that might not seem like a lot.
Sounds like a tiny bit.
Yeah, but that's what gave us, for instance, the intense rainfall in the remnants of Hurricane Ida that drowned 6 people in their bedrooms in Queens in 2021. It's what's giving us more and more Category 4 and 5 hurricanes instead of the relatively weak ones. It's what's giving us these summers that seem endless because of the record heat. It's what's giving us sea level rise because ice is melting, the water goes into the ocean, and in addition, like most fluids, when you heat water, it expands. The ocean takes up more room. Where does it go? It laps onto our beaches, it laps onto the land, it takes land away by erosion. That process is not going to end quickly. It's going to continue until, and in fact, several decades after, we get the emissions of these greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide turned around. We have to convert our energy system to one that is independent of coal, oil, and natural gas. There is good news in all this. It's not all catastrophe. The good news is the US and the world are in the middle of an energy transition. We are gradually getting off fossil fuels. Our emissions are in fact down. The trouble is it's not happening fast enough to really stem the problem in a way which would say, well, we don't have to worry about it, we solved it. We haven't solved it. It's going to get worse before it gets better.
But even with all the efforts that are underway, are greenhouse gas emissions still increasing?
The U.S., for the U.S., our emissions have been decreasing since about 2007. Slowly, but they are decreasing. For the world as a whole, emissions are still increasing, but there are some telltale hints that things are starting to level off. What you have to understand is even if emissions decrease for a while, the amount of the stuff in the atmosphere actually continues to increase. The metaphor is water in a bathtub. If the drain is clogged, you could turn the faucet pretty close to zero before the level stops rising.
Right.
That's the situation we're in.
We talked about going past the 1.5 degree benchmark. In your view, is there a chance that we could get all the way to 2 degrees of warming? And if that's the case, what are the implications of that?
If I had to bet everything I have, I would say warming is going to wind up a little bit above 2 degrees.
Above 2?
Above 2. I think there's a good, well, you have to remember, these are not, these are not.
I'm getting ready to walk off the set
Bob,
because
stay
you're
here.
scaring me that much.
There's more. Some good, some bad. These are not tipping points like we go over them and everybody's dead. They are indications of where the risks start increasing faster. That's the way I like to look at them.
Right.
And so at 1.5 degrees, the risks start increasing or are in the middle of increasing faster than they did over the last several decades. As we get to 2 degrees, which I think we will, later in this century, the risks increase even faster. And let me give you a non-abstract way to understand it. A storm that's really damaging is what we call the 100-year flood. Let's say a coastal storm that causes a flood. They are the benchmark in the US and internationally for significant recovery efforts, significant amount of money having to be spent cleaning up afterwards. Well, the current 100-year flood in New York City, say, will occur by the end of this century, probably once a year or more often. Let me repeat that. The current flood, which is very damaging and which occurs once a century, by the end of before 2100, is likely to occur in New York City once a year if we let the temperature get above about 2 degrees. Now, what does that mean? It means Hurricane Sandy, which was a once in 500-year flood, will occur once every 25 years. You can't sustain the kind of wealthy, comfortable living that the US has in a situation where not just the flooding at the coast, but the inland flooding from intense rains, the extreme heat, which causes the transportation system in the Northeast to collapse, for instance. You can't continue the style of life that we've expected if we let warming just keep going. We have to cut it short. And when it gets, if we get any significant amount above 2 degrees, there's going to be hell to pay, basically.
You mentioned Hurricane Sandy. 2012, it was a devastating storm. There was a magazine article referred to you going out as Hurricane on a night as Hurricane Sandy was approaching, and you went down to the Christopher Street Pier downtown,
That's right.
Greenwich Village, to take a look at the Hudson River. Talk about your experience that night, what you saw and what you thought.
Well, my wife and I didn't want to just sit in our home waiting.
Eleni was with you.
She was with me, Greenwich Village apartment. We didn't want to just sit there, wait to get clobbered. We wanted to see what was going on. And I do this professionally, you know. So we went down to the Hudson River, which is a half-mile west of my house. And we saw the pier, we saw the river, just about at the same level, and we turned and we fled because my building is 15 feet above sea level, and I didn't think the water was going to get up there, and in fact it didn't. But that was scary. I'd never seen anything like it. And you know what really bothers me? Now, even in a high tide, the water starts coming up over the pier, and that's due to sea level rise. And when you combine sea level rise with a big storm like Sandy,
right,
you get a large area flooded, and that's what happened.
Oh my goodness. So you mentioned that there are some good things going on, and the U.S. is actually making what sounds like significant efforts to slow the amount of greenhouse gas emissions going into the atmosphere. But we're not doing enough, obviously, because if the temperatures are still rising, a lot more has to be done. What should we be doing? What are some of the things we should be doing ASAP right here in the United States right now?
Okay, number one, the crowning moment of climate change policy in the U.S. was the signing of the Inflation Reduction Act a couple of years ago. And that
the Biden administration.
The Biden administration. That's been pouring a lot of money and tax credits, subsidies into companies that produce non-fossil fuel energy equipment like solar cells, into individuals who want to invest in solarizing, for instance, or wind power for their houses, or geothermal energy, clean energy. There's a lot of money around now if you want to go out and buy it. The manufacturers are getting the tax breaks and the subsidies. The consumers are getting tax breaks also. And this has juiced the system. It means there's now a huge flourishing business in renewable energy. There was a pretty good business before, not big enough. Now it's really been juiced up. Now is the time for both institutions, like companies or like the government, which like has a huge fleet of cars, for instance, and a lot of buildings, to get into renewable energy. The other part of that act is the attempt to turn the transportation fleet, cars, buses, for instance, into electric vehicles, because you can produce the electricity from solar energy, wind energy, geothermal, and other renewable energy, and you don't produce any pollution. So this is all underway. It's not going to get us all the way to where we need to go, even if the Inflation Reduction Act and every cent in it gets spent wisely, but it's a good kickstart. And once we get over a certain hump, we're going to be at a point where those industries are going to challenge the oil industry, for instance. For political power, the oil industry has been getting in the way of solving this problem for a long time. And I think it'll be much easier for the U.S. to do what it really needs to do. The same story is starting to play out in other countries. The trouble is there are countries that really produce a lot of emissions, like India. They could produce a lot of renewable energy, and they have plans now to do so, and they're starting to implement them, but really aren't going to be cutting their emissions for several decades because they're on the point in the development curve where they can't yet afford to do it. So that's the key. Can the world develop in a way which gives people a healthy, safe, reasonable livelihood? Because otherwise they'll stop doing this stuff. And at the same time do it fast enough so we can stem the greenhouse warming. That's the race we're in.
We've talked about storms and sea level rise. Can you talk a little bit about wildfires? We've had wildfires presumably since there have been forests on the planet. Why should we feel a sense of heightened concern about wildfires now?
Wildfires occur when you have dry tinder, basically, which can be struck by lightning or, as is quite common, where people act irresponsibly and leave a cigarette or a match or whatever. And in fact, most forest fires in the U.S. are ignited originally by humans, but they would be controllable under most circumstances, except in a very hot climate where some areas get not only hot but very dry. you're in a situation which is perfect for the explosion of these fires. Some of these fires get so intense that they actually are like mini thunderstorms with these massive updrafts, which then create rainfall.
They're creating their own weather.
They create their own weather. So, you know, the only way to stop that is A, stop the warming,
right.
B, learn how to manage forests better, C, get human beings to stop tossing around things which cause fires to ignite, and C, have people ready in large enough numbers, these heroes, these firefighters, the jumpers that get in there and stop these things. We don't have enough of them, we don't pay them enough, and basically it's a thankless job. And most of the time, they're kind of losing, a lot of the time, I won't say most of the time, they're losing the battle. We have to be able to cut these fires, not just because they destroy forests and that's an economic thing or it's an ecological thing, right. but because they cause all this air pollution, which is starting to kill people. We got to get out of that vicious cycle.
And in fact, aren't forests supposed to do just the opposite?
Forests
take
take
the carbon out
dioxide
of the
yes.
atmosphere?
Right, but instead, when they burn, they put it right back in. So it's a bad,
right.
vicious circle.
Something that doesn't get talked about a lot are the situation with coral reefs. I mean, a lot of people don't even understand what they are. They're obviously ecologically, well, maybe not obviously, but they are ecologically important, and they tell us a great deal about climate. So tell us what coral reefs are and why they're so important and what's happening to them.
Coral reefs are sometimes called the rainforests of the oceans in terms of biodiversity. I love coral reefs. I do a lot of snorkeling, and they are fantastic. There's nothing I've seen on the surface of the earth that isn't outclassed in a way by what you see under the ocean. Now, that's a personal judgment, of course. Mm-hmm. But it also means that a lot of fish live there. These are nurseries for fish. They're, by the way, what they actually are hunks of calcium material with a lot of living things in the calcium, which are widely distributed in the tropics, particularly near land. And they're not just a tourist thing, which they are, and they are the primary income, the tourists, for a lot of these small islands in the Caribbean and the Pacific, but they also are at the bottom of the base of the food chain for people who live on those islands. A lot of them, what they do for a living and for eating is fish. And what happens is, as the corals are sitting in ocean water, which gets somewhere between 1.5 degrees and 1 and 2 degrees warming, they begin to go through a process called bleaching. That's because of the algae that they're symbiotic with says goodbye, it's too hot here, and goes somewhere else. Eventually the coral bleach, the fish go somewhere else or they die, and we lose this massive ecosystem. If you go to the Caribbean, if you ever went to the Caribbean to snorkel, 30 years ago, it was all fantastic. Now, it's mostly, looks like it's dying.
Wow. So much of what goes on, you know, apart from the danger, aesthetically and then just in terms of the human response to the environment, it just seems so tragic what's occurring.
Well, you know, with human beings, we create a lot of mess. We do bad things, and then we figure out later, and then we run to catch up. The trouble is when you do that with a problem like climate change, which is a worldwide problem, and you know, by the time you catch up, a lot of damage is done. The only comparable problem where we caught up with it just in time was the development of nuclear weapons.
Right.
We let the genie out of the bottle,
right.
and then we spent most of the next 60 years trying to stuff it back in. And, you know, we've been pretty successful at that. But the thing is, with nuclear weapons, you can't afford even one big exchange.
Right.
So who knows what will happen in the future? Well, climate change it's not like one big thing happening. It's just a gradual degradation of the way life is. But it's the same kind of mess, and we have to figure out how to clean it up. And the part that worries me the most is, over the next few decades, as I said, the climate change we're going to get is baked in, and our governments, our institutions, including the U.S. government, are not set up to deal with it. Our emergency governmental agencies like FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, that were set up mostly for rescue and recovery after a disaster are ineffective for preparing in advance to avoid disaster by reducing the risk. That's something the government has to work on.
It's interesting that you mentioned nuclear weapons, because I remember how fearful people used to be, with good reason. It was closer decades ago to the experience people were aware of in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, for example. And it was just kind of an easier thing to understand than climate change. I think one of the issues facing us is that a lot of people, and I don't mean this critically, I think it's tough, they don't really grasp climate change and the importance of what's going on.
It's too abstract,
right?
Unless you've been the victim of some really bad weather, which was exacerbated by climate change, and much increasingly the bad weather we're getting is partly or entirely because of climate change. And so I just want to challenge something you said at the top a little bit, which is I don't think people yawn about this anymore. There's a phenomenon called climate anxiety. In the psychological literature on climate, which I read because I'm a journal editor, it's there, and people talk about it. Experts talk about it. There are more and more people who just don't know what to do with the anxiety of this thing that could come hit them at any moment.
Right.
The younger generation thinks our generation handed them a lousy deal.
Well, they're correct, aren't they?
On many fronts. But this one in particular is unique to, it's a risk that the previous generations didn't understand. Right. In fact, yawned at. I don't get that reaction anymore. I teach students. I meet students from universities all over the country. I meet young people in communities all over the country when I go speak. They're worried about this. It's not, something that, this is more crap the adults are talking about, I don't want to think about it. They think about it much more frequently than people of our age.
It's interesting because the young people are the ones who are going to experience the most profound effects of climate change. But it's also the young people where the answers ultimately are going to have to come from. You mentioned something that was akin to a climate czar, and perhaps the need for something like that in the U.S. Can you talk about that a little bit? If there was one person or one agency in charge of moving forward on this, how would that work?
Yeah, and this is not my idea. The Biden administration has thought about it, just ran out of time to do anything about it. The Housing and Urban Development deals with public housing, and there is no air conditioning in most of public housing. What do they do when it's extremely hot? FEMA deals with cleanup after a disaster, but they have a little bit of money and they have the legal authority to actually start and encourage the process at the state and local level of planning and implementing ways to defend areas like New York City or like someplace in the Great Plains, which is, drying out. They have the money, or they have some of the money, but Congress has beggared them, and they don't have, they could use 100 times as much money as they're getting for those advanced programs. The Army Corps of Engineers is responsible for building big infrastructure along the coast and helping people move out if they want to move out. But they don't do a very good job at it. All they know how to do is pour concrete. They don't know how to interact well with communities and figure out what's good for individual communities. What needed is what the Biden administration called a whole of government approach, and that means the agencies have to talk to each other. But I've kind of given up on that. They don't talk to each other very well. I think we need a new agency that's the Climate Protection Agency, basically, and there has to be somebody in charge who has cabinet level authority and access to the president. Till that happens, we're never going to be doing an adequate job, and we're going to fall further and further behind, even as we might be doing better and better, just because the climate is going to change faster and faster until we cut emissions. So we're at a pretty critical juncture here, where we have to learn how to do both at once. Got to cut emissions, got to learn how to protect ourselves.
You were a scientist. How did you come to focus so much of your attention on climate?
I first heard of it in 1969. I went to MIT. I read the MIT Alumni Magazine. There was a story on the ways human beings could change the climate. I thought about, what are you talking about? How could human beings change the climate?
Right.
And then I read it, and there were 6 different ways, and one of them was pumping up the greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That got lodged in some part of my brain. Then I just put it aside, got my PhD as a physical chemist, but I always had my eye on what can we do to help the Earth get through disasters, potential disasters like climate change. And at that time, this was like 1970, air pollution. Earth Day was the first Earth Day.
Earth Day was
that
new
day.
in 1970.
That's right.
Yep.
I taught a 5th grade class in Chicago. That was my contribution. It just snowballed from there, and my career got turned away from what at the time was looking at the stars. It was astrophysics, the chemistry of outer space, toward the chemistry and physics of the climate. And so by around the time that I was, 35 years old or so, I decided that would be my career.
We're glad you're there.
Thank you.
Keep doing what you're doing, and we're glad you came in to talk to us.
Always happy to do it.
Dr. Michael Oppenheimer.
Thank you, Bob.
I'm Bob Herbert. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time. CUNY TV now has an app. Downloading the CUNY TV app lets you join us anytime from anywhere.